Introspection. In Senegal, students organized forums to discuss colonial-era treaties. In Mali, activists demanded the removal of French military bases. In Cameroon, youth groups launched campaigns to teach pre-colonial history in schools. The Anthem moment had cracked something open, a long-buried hunger for self-definition. Even in France, the impact was felt. Editorials shifted tone. Some questioned the country's post-colonial posture. Others called for a reimagining of Franco-African relations. The establishment bristled, but the conversation had begun, and it wasn't going away. Traoré, once dismissed as a radical, was now a symbol, not of rebellion, but of reclamation, not of chaos, but of clarity. His silence had become a rallying cry for millions who had never seen themselves reflected in power. He didn't just challenge a song, he challenged a system. And yet, the most profound shift wasn't in headlines or hashtags. It was in the quiet moments, in classrooms where children now stood taller, in homes where elders whispered, "We never thought we'd see this day," in hearts that had long carried the weight of erasure and now felt, for the first time, seen. But the biggest impact wasn't online. It was in the hearts of millions. Days after the Anthem moment, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of citizens, not in a palace, but in a public square. No teleprompter, no grand theatrics, just a microphone, the Burkinabe flag behind him, and the weight of a continent on his shoulders. He looked out at the crowd, eyes steady, voice calm. "We are not disrespecting a nation," he said. "We are reclaiming our own." The words landed like thunder, not with anger, but with clarity. Traoré wasn't apologizing. He was explaining, not to France, but to his people, to every African who had ever been told that dignity must be earned through silence, that pride must be softened for diplomacy, that sovereignty must be negotiated. No anthem, he continued, should drown out the heartbeat of a free people. He spoke of history, not as a burden, but as a compass, of ancestors who resisted colonization with bare hands and unbreakable spirit, of leaders who were silenced for dreaming too loudly, of children who deserved to grow up knowing that their identity was not a compromise. This wasn't just a protest, he said. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer perform respect for a legacy that never respected them, that silence in the face of injustice was no longer an option, that unity wasn't just a slogan, it was a strategy. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in affirmation. Cheers, chants, tears. Elders nodded. Youth raised their phones, capturing history in real time. The moment wasn't about Traoré anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt erased, belittled, or forgotten. Across Africa, the speech was replayed like scripture. In classrooms, it sparked debates. In homes, it sparked hope. In parliaments, it sparked courage. Leaders who had once tread carefully around colonial ties began to speak more boldly. The anthem moment had opened a door, and Traoré's words had pushed it wide. He didn't call for revenge. He called for remembrance. He didn't preach division. He preached dignity. And in doing so, he reframed the narrative. No longer was Africa reacting to the West. It was defining itself, on its own terms, in its own voice. Justice, identity, pride, unity. These weren't just ideals. They were the pillars of a new era. An era where silence is no longer mistaken for peace. Where defiance is not disorder, but direction. Where leaders are not measured by their obedience, but by their courage. Traoré's speech didn't end with applause. It ended with a promise. That day in the stadium, he said, we didn't just turn our backs. We turned a page. And the world listened. Because in that moment, Burkina Faso wasn't just a country. It was a mirror reflecting the power of peaceful defiance, the strength of collective pride, and the unshakable truth that dignity is not given. It is claimed. And the anthem of that claim was silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave a flag. He simply turned his back, and 60,000 people followed. Ibrahim Traoré's quiet defiance didn't just echo through a stadium. It thundered across continents. This was never about disrespect. It was about reclaiming what was never meant to be surrendered: identity, pride, and the right to stand tall without apology. From the soil of Burkina Faso to the screens of millions, the message was unmistakable. Dignity is louder than any anthem. We watched a leader refuse to perform submission. We saw a crowd become a chorus of resistance. And we felt, deep in our bones, that something had shifted. This wasn't just a protest. It was a declaration. A reminder that silence can roar, and that unity can rise from a single act of courage. Now it's your turn. If this moment moved you, subscribe, share, and let the world know. Dignity is louder than any anthem. Let this story live beyond the screen. Let it spark conversations, challenge assumptions, and inspire others to stand for what they believe in. Because when one voice rises, others follow. And when 60,000 rise together, the world listens. The stadium was electric. 60,000 voices buzzed with anticipation, flags of red, green, and gold rippling like waves in a storm. Cameras panned across the crowd, catching faces painted with pride, fists raised in unity, and eyes locked on the man at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré. Then, the music began. A familiar melody echoed through the speakers, the French national anthem. Its notes, once symbols of power and empire, now hung in the air like an unwanted ghost. The crowd shifted. Some looked confused. Others looked furious. But Traoré didn't flinch. He turned, not toward the anthem, away from it. In one deliberate motion, Ibrahim Traoré turned his back to the sound and to the history it carried. The cameras caught it. The silence swallowed the stadium. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then it happened. One voice shouted, then 10, then thousands. A roar erupted, not of chaos, but of clarity. The anthem of Burkina Faso rose from the crowd, louder than the speakers, louder than the past. Flags waved harder. Tears streamed down cheeks. The people weren't just watching history. They were becoming it. When Ibrahim Traoré turned his back on the anthem, 60,000 people followed. What happened next changed Africa forever. But this wasn't just a protest. It was a reckoning decades in the making. To understand the weight of that moment, Ibrahim Traoré turning his back on the French anthem, you have to rewind history. Not just years, but centuries. Burkina Faso, once called Upper Volta, was carved by colonial hands, its borders drawn not by its people, but by foreign powers. France ruled it with iron and arrogance, extracting resources, erasing languages, and branding its people with an identity not their own. Even after independence, the shadow lingered. French troops remained. French corporations dominated. French influence seeped into every corner of governance. The anthem wasn't just a song, it was a reminder. A reminder of who had once claimed ownership of their land, their dignity, their future. And then came Traoré, young, defiant, and unapologetically African. He didn't rise through polished political channels. He emerged from the ranks of the military, propelled by frustration, by the cries of a generation tired of being told who they were. His speeches didn't flatter France. They challenged it. His policies didn't bend to foreign interests. They broke from them. So when the anthem played and Traoré turned away, it wasn't just symbolic. It was seismic. It was a declaration, we are not yours. The crowd knew it. That's why they roared. That's why they sang their own anthem louder than the speakers could drown. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't staged. It was instinct, a collective reclaiming of identity. And yet, the stakes were higher than anyone realized. France had already expressed unease with Traoré's leadership. Sanctions loomed. Media outlets painted him as a populist firebrand. Diplomats whispered of instability. But Traoré didn't flinch. Because for him, this wasn't about politics. It was about pride, about history, about refusing to bow. And just when the crowd thought they'd seen it all, the real shock came next. Long before Ibrahim Traoré stood in that stadium, France had already written its script for Burkina Faso, and it didn't include defiance. The colonial legacy was not just a chapter in history books. It was a living architecture of control. From the language spoken in schools to the currency printed with foreign signatures, France's fingerprints were everywhere. Independence had been declared, yes, but sovereignty? That was still contested. French officials spoke of partnership, of shared values, but their actions told another story. Military bases remained stationed on Burkinabe soil, not by invitation, but by inertia. French corporations extracted gold and cotton, while local communities struggled to access clean water. Aid came with strings. Diplomacy came with lectures. And when leaders like Thomas Sankara tried to cut those strings, they were silenced, permanently. So when Traoré rose to power, young and unyielding, Paris didn't see a reformer. They saw a threat. French media wasted no time. Headlines branded him a populist firebrand, a militant nationalist, even a dangerous radical. Commentators scoffed at his age, questioned his legitimacy, and warned of instability. Behind closed doors, diplomats whispered of sanctions, of pressure points, of ways to contain him. But Traoré didn't play their game. He didn't respond with fiery speeches or retaliatory threats. He responded with silence, with posture, with presence. When French officials demanded respect, demanded protocol, demanded homage, Traoré gave them something else, quiet defiance. It was this contrast that made the moment in the stadium so powerful. The anthem began, and France expected obedience, expected decorum, expected the same performance they'd seen for decades. But Traoré turned his back, not with rage, but with resolve. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He simply refused. And that refusal echoed louder than any insult. It exposed the hypocrisy, the arrogance, the tone-deaf diplomacy of a nation still clinging to its colonial ego. France, a country that preached liberty, equality, fraternity, yet demanded submission from its former colonies. A country that lectured on human rights while profiting from unequal treaties. A country that called Traoré a radical for doing what any sovereign leader should, stand for his people. The backlash was swift. French officials condemned the act as disrespectful. Analysts warned it would damage relations. One former ambassador called it a slap in the face of diplomacy. But to the people of Burkina Faso and to millions across Africa, it was something else entirely. It was a mirror held up to decades of exploitation, of condescension, of erasure. And in that reflection, they saw the truth, that dignity doesn't come from permission. It comes from conviction. Traoré didn't need to explain himself. His silence was the statement. His posture was the protest. And the crowd understood. Because this wasn't just about one man. It was about every African who'd ever been told to be grateful for their chains. Every immigrant who'd ever been asked to prove their worth. Every nation that had been told its history began with colonization. But Traoré wasn't done. His silence was louder than any speech, and the crowd was about to erupt. He wasn't born into power. Ibrahim Traoré came from the soil, the same red earth that stained the boots of farmers and soldiers alike. Raised in a modest home in Kara, he knew the weight of silence, the sting of injustice, and the quiet pride of a people who had endured more than they ever deserved. His father was a teacher. His mother, a market vendor. They taught him that dignity wasn't something given. It was something protected. As a boy, he watched elders speak in hushed tones about France, about coups, about leaders who rose with fire and fell with betrayal. He learned early that in Burkina Faso, truth was dangerous and courage was rare. Traoré chose the military not for glory, but for discipline. He believed that if change was ever going to come, it would have to be earned, not begged for. He trained relentlessly, rising through the ranks not because of connections, but because of conviction. His fellow soldiers saw something in him, a quiet intensity, a refusal to bend, a fire that didn't flicker. But it wasn't just his strength that set him apart. It was his vision. He spoke of sovereignty, of African unity, of a Burkina Faso that didn't need permission to dream. He rejected foreign aid that came with strings. He questioned alliances that served outsiders more than his own people. And when he saw corruption infecting the highest levels of government, he didn't look away. He acted. The coup that brought him to power wasn't a grab for control. It was a cry for liberation. He didn't promise perfection. He promised resistance. Resistance to exploitation. Resistance to puppetry. Resistance to the idea that Burkina Faso's destiny belonged to anyone but its own people. And the risks were real. He faced threats from abroad, skepticism from within, and relentless pressure to conform. But he didn't flinch. He wore his uniform not as armor, but as a symbol that he was still a soldier, still in service, still fighting for something larger than himself. His speeches were short, his tone measured, but his actions roared. He expelled foreign troops. He nationalized key industries. He walked through villages not with an entourage, but with humility. And everywhere he went, people saw the same thing. A man who hadn't forgotten where he came from. Traoré wasn't just leading a country. He was carrying generations of trauma on his back. generations who had been told they were lesser, who had been taught to bow, who had been erased from their own history. And that's why, when the anthem played, he didn't flinch. He stood for something bigger. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. French media lit up with condemnation. Primetime anchors called Traoré's gesture a dangerous provocation, while op-eds accused him of undermining diplomatic norms. One columnist went further, branding him a reckless populist playing with fire. The tone was unmistakable, outrage wrapped in condescension. Paris issued a formal statement within hours. The Foreign Ministry expressed deep disappointment, citing the anthem snub as an affront to shared history. Behind closed doors, diplomats scrambled. Meetings were called. Pressure mounted. The message was clear: France would not tolerate defiance. But across Africa, the tone was different. Very different. Commentators from Dakar to Nairobi rallied behind Traoré. On talk shows, analysts dissected the moment with reverence. "This is not disrespect," one said. "It's reclamation." Social media exploded. Hashtags like #TraoréStands and #AfricaUnbowed surged across platforms. Memes flooded timelines. Traoré silhouetted against the anthem, fists raised, flags flying. Twitter became a battlefield. French politicians tweeted calls for restoring decorum. African youth replied with fire. "We don't owe you our silence." One post read, retweeted over 100,000 times. Influencers shared clips of the stadium moment, overlaying it with music, poetry, and pride. The narrative was shifting and fast. In Burkina Faso, the streets buzzed with energy. Local radio stations played the national anthem on loop. Murals of Traoré began appearing overnight. Schoolchildren recited his speech. Elders spoke of Sankara's spirit returning. The defiance wasn't just political, it was cultural, generational, spiritual. And yet, the tension kept rising. France hinted at economic consequences. Aid packages were reevaluated. Trade agreements were under review. But Traoré didn't blink. He didn't issue rebuttals or apologies. He simply stood firm, and the silence spoke volumes. The world watched. Commentators speculated. Would Traoré fold under pressure? Would the crowd retreat? Would the moment fade? But then came the moment no one expected, the crowd's answer. It began with a single voice. From the far end of the stadium, a woman stood, hand over heart, eyes locked on Ibrahim Traoré. Her voice trembled at first, but it carried. The opening lines of Burkina Faso's national anthem rising above the fading notes of France's. Then another joined. Then dozens. Then thousands. Within seconds, the entire stadium was singing. Flags whipped through the air like waves in a storm. Red, green, and gold shimmered against the sun. Children on shoulders, elders with tears in their eyes, soldiers, standing at attention, all united in one sound. The anthem wasn't just music. It was memory. It was resistance. It was home. The cameras caught it all. Slow-motion shots of faces lit with pride. Close-ups of fists raised in rhythm. A panoramic sweep of the crowd, 60,000 strong, singing not in protest, but in proclamation. The French anthem had tried to echo through the speakers, but the people had drowned it out with something louder, identity. And in the center of it all stood Traoré. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood, calm, composed, unshaken. His silence was thunderous. His posture defiant. He didn't need to shout. The crowd was his voice now. A child near the front clutched a handmade sign. "We are not your colony." A woman waved a photo of Thomas Sankara, her eyes wet with reverence. A group of students unfurled a massive banner that read, "Dignity is our anthem." Social media exploded. Videos of the moment flooded every platform. One clip, Traoré standing still as the crowd erupted, hit 1 million views in under an hour. A tweet went viral. "This is Africa's new anthem, dignity." Celebrities reposted it. Activists quoted it. Diaspora communities from Paris to Toronto shared it with pride. The narrative had shifted. France's condemnation looked hollow now. Their outrage, performative. Because the world wasn't watching a diplomatic spat. It was witnessing a cultural uprising. A reclamation. A mic drop moment that didn't need words, just presence. Journalists scrambled to reframe the story. Some tried to paint it as chaos. But the footage betrayed them. There was no violence. No disorder. Just unity. Just clarity. Just a people standing tall. In the days that followed, The moment was dissected like scripture. Commentators called it the Anthem reversal. Historians compared it to Mandela's Stadium Walk. Students studied it in classrooms. Artists painted it on walls. It became more than a protest. It became a symbol. And Traoré? He remained silent. No press conference. No rebuttal. No apology. Just quiet strength. He let the people speak. Let the moment breathe. Let the anthem echo. One journalist wrote, "He didn't just turn his back on a song. He turned his back on a legacy and invited his people to do the same." And they did. The stadium became sacred ground. Visitors came just to stand where it happened. Musicians sampled the crowd's chant. Poets wrote verses about the silence that roared. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't planned. It was organic. It was real. And just when the dust settled, the ripple effect began. The moment Ibrahim Traoré turned his back on the French anthem didn't end in the stadium. It detonated across the globe. Within hours, social media was ablaze. The clip of Traoré standing firm while 60,000 voices drowned out colonial echoes became the most shared video on the continent. Hashtags like hashtag Traoré stands, hashtag Africa Unbowed, and hashtag Dignity Anthem surged to the top of trending lists in Dakar, Lagos, Johannesburg, and unexpectedly, in Paris. Diaspora communities lit up with pride. In Harlem, murals appeared overnight. In London, spoken word artists performed verses inspired by the moment. In Marseille, young Africans posted videos turning their backs to the French anthem in solidarity. The message was clear. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's story. It was Africa's. Celebrities weighed in. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "Traoré didn't just stand. He lifted a continent." A football star posted a photo of himself with the Burkinabe flag, captioned, "Respect is earned. Dignity is chosen." Even politicians couldn't ignore it. African leaders, once cautious, began referencing Traoré's stance in speeches. One called it the most powerful silence in modern African history. But the ripple effect didn't stop at admiration. It sparked